So starting off, the kind of guiding questions for the project and for this talk today are, what is the public? What does it mean to participate in the public and to engage in acts of citizenship? In particular, what is the meaning of democracy under conditions of extreme inequality, when access to public participation in the conventional sense is by and large limited to those with material, cultural, and social resources? These are some of the guiding questions that are framing this presentation and the broader research project. So I'm going to start off by sketching a conceptual framework, drawing largely on the work of Hannah Arendt and Pierre Bourdieu. Then Valerie is going to talk about the logistics and process of conducting our research, what we did over a period of about 8 months in the field. And then then we'll show the films. Sorry, that's important. Then we'll show the films. And then after that, I'll return to some of the concepts to talk about them in relation to one specific example, just to see, to try and illustrate how we're working with these theories. And then we'll open the floor to discussion, and hopefully there'll be lots of time for discussion. So I'll begin with Hannah Arendt's conception of the public sphere and of action within it. I am drawing here primarily on her book, The Human Condition, as well as on a beautiful interpretation that was offered by Hannah Arendt's biographer, Elizabeth Young Brill, who wrote several books on Arendt. This one was called Why Arendt Matters. So Arendt's concept of the public marks a radical departure from Western philosophical traditions in a number of ways. One is that she sees the line between public and private as much fuzzier than is typically described in Greek philosophy or the philosophies of Western liberal theorists such as John Locke. As she notes, the emergence of society, the rise of housekeeping, its activities, problems, and organizational devices, from the shadowy interior of the household into the light of the public sphere, has not only blurred the old borderline between private and political, it has also changed almost beyond recognition the meaning of the two terms and their significance for the life of the individual and the citizen. Arendt was critical of the social, which she saw as the realm of care, nurturance, housekeeping. And it wasn't that she saw the social as unnecessary to everyday life. Obviously, she understood that we need those things in our lives to survive. But one of the problems of modern society, in her view, was that the social has come to be conflated with the political and with the nation state, and that this has resulted in the submersion of individual will and plurality under those conditions. She writes, "Whether a nation state consists of equals or non-equals is of no great importance in this respect, for society always demands that its members act as though they were members of one enormous family which has only one opinion and one interest." So, to her, the result of this conflation of the social with the political is the disappearance of individual uniqueness, what Arendt calls plurality. When the social takes the place of the political, an individual's who-ness disappears, this is a term she used, to be replaced with their whatness. This submersion of plurality means that an individual's unique traits, their qualities, their humanity, are subsumed and become invisible. In the case of the research we're doing, we might understand the category, for example, of homeless youth as an instance of whatness that serves to conceal the individual humanity belonging to each person with whom we worked. We also might understand the realm of the social to have overtaken the political in the case of homeless youth, who are locked into discourses of care and deviance, who are already seen as subjects without agency, both because they are young and also because they are homeless. And I'll return to this concept a little bit after we watch the films to elaborate on its relevance. For Arendt, the public is the realm of action, and it is through action that one's who-ness can be revealed in what Arendt calls the space of appearances. Now, Arendt was a phenomenologist. She was trained by Martin Heidegger, and this sensibility, the phenomenological sensibility, permeates her political philosophy. So this space of appearances, it's a deeply phenomenological concept, and it refers by the means by which we come to visibility with others, not as objects, but instead as perceiving and perceived beings who must always be in relation to others. In other words, the space of the public is a space of relations, or a web of relations is a term that Arendt used. We act within the public always in relation to others, and it is amongst others with whom we reveal our who-ness through actions and speech. This definition of public is distinct from our generalized sense of the public realm that we carry in Western society as somehow belonging to the space of what we now call political structures, participation in town meetings or voting or writing letters to politicians. It is much broader than that. It might encompass those things, but it's also broader than that. And it's marked by the fact that all humans must come together within a society at a shared table, a common space of interests that bind us together and yet also keep us separate. So under this definition, the public is made up of, I don't think I did a slide for this, did I? No. Of the organization or constitution of the power people have when they come together as talking and acting beings, as opposed to our conventional understanding of politics, which is deeply entrenched in Western traditions, as the domination of some people, one or a few or many, over other people, requiring the threat or use of violence. So, one of the paradoxes of the public sphere, as defined by Arendt, is that we can never actually know how our actions will manifest. In entering into the public in relation with others, just as we are born into a pre-existing world of relationships and have little capacity to discern how things will turn out, so too our actions in the world once taken are beyond our control. As Arendt notes, it is because of this already existing web of human relationships, with its innumerable conflicting wills and intentions, that action almost never achieves its purpose. She identifies this as one of the frustrations of action, and one of the reasons that states and governments and other kinds of elites might try to curb or control actions. As Elizabeth Young-Bruhl notes, this frustration of action can be described from another angle by saying that actions do not have results the way fabricating processes do, and actors' actions become part of a web of other people's actions, and such a web, never still and solid, cannot be understood or viewed as a whole until the actors have exited the stage. So, Arendt's political philosophy is inherently egalitarian. As Young-Bruhl notes, Arendt began with the idea that action is open to all people, in all their diversity or plurality. It requires no special talents, although in many situations it requires the virtue of courage, because it arises from or is ontologically rooted in the human condition of natality, the condition of being born. Thus, Arendt paints a picture of potentials, of the possibility for all to participate in the public as their birthright, and that public as a much broader space than the narrow political definitions with which we are currently familiar. Yet, questions remain. In contexts of enormous inequality, where conditions of poverty, police violence, abuse, exploitation, addiction, and disempowerment are lived daily, the potential for people to reveal their who-ness to others at the context of a shared table of common concern is severely curtailed. Even if Arendt's conception of the public is accurate, she provides no guidance to illuminate the process by which people might escape the clutches of the social and its dehumanizing capacity, and instead participate in the public as equals. Hers is an ideal form, and it does not account for inequality of access and opportunity. So it's here that I turn to the work of Pierre Bourdieu, whose concepts describe the processes by which inequality is reproduced. Bourdieu's work was motivated by a deep concern with the constraints that inhibited the capacities and opportunities of those who were not born into the elite classes. He himself was born into a working class family in France and made his way up through the echelons of France's higher university system. Bourdieu's work helps us understand how those who are born into poverty often remain in poverty, and also can help us think through what this means for participating in a public realm such as that described by Arendt. I should also note that Bourdieu was deeply suspicious of phenomenology, and this is a place where Bourdieu and I have had to part paths. And his suspicion is for precisely the reason I've just outlined. He states that phenomenological analysis is so perfectly neutralized politically that one can read it without drawing any political conclusions. And that as a researcher, one has to examine the question of the social conditions that have to be fulfilled to make possible the experience of the social world as self-evident, which phenomenology describes without providing itself with the means of accounting for it. So in other words, because you always need an in other words with Bourdieu to make sense of what he's saying, I do love his writing, but it's dense. Phenomenological approaches to the social world run the risk of overlooking the social constraints and effects of inequality on people's experiences of the world, and thus on their capacity to participate in it in particular ways. Now, others have challenged Bourdieu's reading of phenomenology, and as I said, I'm not convinced that he had a fair or robust interpretation of phenomenology's potential, particularly as elucidated by theorists such as Arendt. But his point about the need to understand the social conditions that have to be fulfilled to make possible the experience of the social world is an important one and is part of our project here. Now, like Arendt, Bourdieu was deeply committed to democratic politics, and he intervened in the political stage throughout his career, both through his intellectual work and also through activism, media engagement, and education. But he was also skeptical of claims made by political scientists that the public sphere was available to everyone, claims like that made by Arendt. As his student Loic Vicant points out, Bourdieu's general principle of political engagement involved first to acknowledge that the conditions of access to political expression are not universally granted a priori to all, but that, on the contrary, they are socially determined and differentially allocated, and then to work to universalize the ability and the propensity to act and think politically. That is, to universalize realistic means of gaining access to that particular historical embodiment of the universal, that is democratic politics as we know it. In other words, first, we must understand that people are constrained in participating in the public, and then we must figure out how to lift those constraints, how to eliminate or reduce those constraints. So what Vicant refers to as the historical embodiment of the universal refers to what Bourdieu would refer to as the political dispositions that are necessary to take part in the political world, the habitus of political engagement that has managed to shake off the effects of symbolic violence. I'm throwing around a lot of Bourdieusian concepts here. So to shake off the effects of symbolic violence long enough to see that there is potential for change in acting politically. You need to come to the belief that such and such a future, desired or feared, is possible, probable, or inevitable, that this can, in certain conjunctures, mobilize around itself a whole group and thus contribute to fostering or preventing the coming of that future. In other words, acting politically, participating in the public sphere, in Arendt's language, does not come easily and naturally to all, though Bourdieu would agree with Arendt that we all carry the potential for it. But such potential can be displaced by the embodied dispositions of acquiescence or refusal or avoidance, or simply of absorbing the dominant circulating discourses of oneself as incapable of political thought or political intervention. It can manifest in a sense of fatalism, that nothing matters because nothing can change, an experience that has been borne out over and over in the lives of the youth with whom we worked for this research. Yet, when provided with the space and the attention and the affirmations that their opinions were relevant and would be heard, honored, and appreciated, the youth we worked with fluently offered up their insightful and complex articulations of the structures that prevented them from succeeding in the world and the barriers that kept them down, which hopefully you'll see in the films. So Bourdieu understands democracy not as an affirmative state of formal equality, equal capacity, or shared freedoms, but as a historical process of active negation of social negation, a never-ending effort to make social relations less arbitrary, institutions less unjust, distributions of resources and options less imbalanced, recognition less scarce. In other words, democracy is not a given, but rather a constant act of taking back public space from the incursions of inequality. Arendt would agree with this conceptualization, although in The Human Condition she conceives of the public in a more positive light. But as Elizabeth Young-Brill notes, Arendt was primarily concerned with the question, what elements can preserve freedom or help people achieve freedom? Like Bourdieu, she understood democracy not as a given, but as a process, as an ongoing effort to stave off totalitarianism, inequality, brutality, and violence. So those are the kind of broad concepts that we're working with in this presentation. And having traced some of these concepts, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Valerie, who's going to describe the research process that we went through. And then after that, we'll show you the films and come back to the concepts for a sort of sum up.
All right, thanks everybody for coming out. It's great to see such a good turnout. I'm going to give an overview of the process of making the films and the different methods we used in the research process leading up to filmmaking. I'll also provide some analysis of how the process worked for us. But before I do that, I want to give a shout out to Lynette Schick. She's a master's student in social work who's another RA on this project. And unfortunately, she couldn't be here today, but she's been involved with this process from the beginning as well. So the project was set up to run in 3 phases. All of these phases were designed to elicit youth's perspectives on democracy and citizenship, and designed to build towards an action or an advocacy project with the youth. As you will see, this did not quite work out the way that we expected. So in phase 1, we did a series of focus groups. We first met with several different youth-serving organizations with the goal of determining their level of interest in this project and which organization would be the best fit for this project. We started by approaching 3 different youth-serving organizations in Ottawa, which we thought they might be interested in hosting for a variety of reasons. We first met with a staff person, introduced ourselves, gave an overview of the project. If they were interested in pursuing this opportunity, then we set up a focus group with the youth at this organization for the following weeks. So in this initial focus group, we did a thermometer exercise where we read out statements about citizenship and democracy, and the youth placed themselves along the thermometer, so along a continuum of hot or cold, which was just sort of a fake space on the floor, with hot being how strongly they connected with that statement, and cold being that it was a weak connection. So this gave us a glimpse of where the youth saw themselves in relation to the state, to community, to democracy, and to different services that they might access. As a research team, we then met to discuss which organization we felt it would be best to continue with. There were several factors that led to our final choice. An important one was the times that they had available for us to come in. Once that decision was made, we then held 2 more focus groups with youth at the drop-in we selected. These focus groups utilized several different methods. First, we did a spatial mapping exercise where youth drew on a map of Ottawa where they felt safe or unsafe. And we held roundtable discussions on different issues. And we also created good citizen and bad citizen drawings that were collectively made with the group, with a discussion of what each one meant for the youth. In terms of analysis, the mapping exercise in particular provoked great group discussions and was really a helpful tool for us in getting a sense of how the youth access the city. Depending on the group, discussions either flowed or were more subdued. We also noticed that women in particular needed prompting to share their views. And to mitigate this, we strove to have a gender balance in our focus groups, which didn't always work out, but that was something that we worked on with the organization. Phase 2 was a photo project and walking interviews. So this second phase, we used spatial and visual tools to get a sense of how the youth see and use the city. We started with a photography project over 3 sessions in which youth were first given disposable cameras and encouraged to take pictures of the ways in which they engaged with the city, where they felt safe or unsafe, and what democracy looked like to them. At the second session, we got the cameras back in order to develop the film, and we held a focus group discussion. And at the final session, we returned the photos to the youth, and the youth made journals with their photos, which described why these photos were important to them and why they chose these particular photos to go in the journals. After the photography project, and at that time we also conducted some individual interviews. So after the photography project was complete, we asked the youth to take us on walking interviews around the city. So with 2 voice recorders and 2 team members, we accompanied 2 to 3 youth for a walk around downtown. These were very rich, and I got the sense that the youth really enjoyed showing off different meaningful spaces to them and how they navigated the city. In terms of analysis for this stage, the photography project in particular really threw into relief how difficult it was to establish a continuous relationship with youth. And this was for a number of reasons. Their lives were very unstructured, they've got a lot going on. we had already noticed that the same youth did not necessarily return for subsequent focus groups, even if it was like a continual project like the photography project was. So even when they had expressed really strong interest in what we were doing. So with the photography project, for example, some youth never returned with their camera to be developed. Others dropped off the camera and never returned for their pictures. So we were talking about this, and one youth worker described how a week could feel like a month for these youth, given everything that they were managing in their lives. So this was a challenge, but we managed it by maintaining a pretty free-flowing process that youth could enter or exit at any time. This meant taking more time for introductions and explanations at the beginning of every session, but it also meant that we had to work harder at establishing trust every time because there were usually new faces around the table. I found it also had a positive aspect because it meant we could return to the same topics if we wanted to probe more deeply, and it wouldn't feel like a repeat for the youth because many of them wouldn't have been there for the initial discussion. The final phase was the action phase. This was intended to be a culmination of the first two phases and was left intentionally open, as we had hoped that the action or advocacy project would organically come from the youth involved and that they would be integrally involved in carrying it out. We had been building enthusiasm for this phase throughout by encouraging youth to think about what kind of action projects they wanted to work on, what kind of issues they wanted to talk about. However, we had already noticed, like I said, that it was challenging to build a continuous relationship with the youth and that a regular ongoing commitment to something was a barrier to them. So there were a number of suggestions, many involving art or creativity of some kind, but very few suggestions specifically related to what would be traditionally seen as political action, such as speaking at City Hall. Some youth suggested creating a video. There had been another group working on a video with youth some months before, and this felt like a good fit for us because youth could feasibly come in and out of this project as well. And some of the youth who expressed an interest did continue with this phase of the project, which was exciting. Others were new, so it did lend itself to a more fluid dynamic. At the same time, the films are now a product that can be used in a variety of different ways. So instead of an action project that the youth are carrying out themselves, we have ended up with more of an advocacy tool that youth can be brought into at different junctures or use themselves if they want. We held 3 different focus groups to figure out what topics we should cover in the films. We used Dotmocracy, which, if you haven't used it before, it's a visual form of voting where the youth were all given 3 dots, and there were 6 topics posted around the room, and they could pick their top 3 choices. And then we had a conversation about them. There was also space for them to add new issues if they felt there was a topic that they wanted to be covered that wasn't in the list already. These topics that we came up with were a mix of issues that are important to youth that kept coming up through focus groups or through individual conversations that we'd been having. And the topics also came from our sense of which issues would have traction right now in the broader community and in the social services world. We connected with a local filmmaker, Ben Hoskin, also props to him and his team who couldn't be here today, and they helped us with the technical aspects of filming. We initially booked 2 days for filming, but in the end we only had to use 1. We set up the filming so that in the morning we would film a focus group with the youth, and in the afternoon we would film walking interviews with them. One challenge was that we could not film faces for confidentiality reasons. So this meant that the film crew had to be particularly creative in terms of shot angles that they were using or B-roll, which is the filler in terms of streetscape or scenery. So, and for the walking interviews, the youth divided into 2 groups of 3 to 4 people. And we had a team of about 5 to 6 people following them, which was pretty fun. That included the film crew. We screened the film with the youth. Only a couple of them came back to see the screening.
The crowd of us walking behind.
Yeah.
Not the guy with the backpack.
Yeah, isn't that the sound guy? No? Okay. All right. Random dude. Okay. So we screened the film with the youth, the films. Only a couple of them came back to see it. And we got feedback from them on what they wanted included or excluded. We also screened it with the organization where we conducted the filming and got their feedback. We have started sharing the films at conferences and in classes. In terms of how the filming went, we got the sense that the youth really enjoyed being famous for a day. It was a pretty professional-looking film crew, and they were attracting a lot of attention, both positive and negative. It was complicated by the fact that this negative attention was also spatially related. So there were some places that the youth didn't want to be filmed in, such as Rideau Street, where they might be perceived as traitors or moles or police informants and things like that. So we were very sensitive around their spatial limitations. This also came up in the walking interview, so it was something that we were aware of, and we balanced that in where we went to walk. So now we're going to turn to the films, and you can see the final product.
So I want to talk a little bit then about trying to bring some of the concepts that I outlined in the first part of the presentation into conversation with the research process and the process of making the films. So I'm only gonna go into one particular dilemma, although there are many, but just to start kind of thinking through and to illustrate the ways in which I imagine these concepts being useful. So one dilemma we had then was around the issue of what ultimately became the pot video, the decriminalizing marijuana video. So from the very first focus group that we held with the youth, the issue of decriminalizing marijuana was a hot issue. It was named right from the beginning. We started in February, the first set of focus groups, and this was a couple of months before the annual 420 gatherings, which I actually didn't know what those were, and they laughed at me. It's okay. And so those are the annual gatherings on April 20th on Parliament Hill to protest the criminalization of pot and to advocate for legalization. So a lot of the youth mentioned having attended this, where they didn't name other kinds of protests and events like in that genre, and they were planning to attend again. One of the youth even gave me a marijuana leaf eraser. I still have it. It smells like pot, and a button. So it was a hot topic. In our debrief after the session, Valerie and Lynette and I, we audio recorded our debriefs after, and this is a transcript of it. And the transcriptionist wasn't sure whose voice was whose, because I guess our three female voices sound very similar. So I think the different font or italicized not indicates different people talking. But here it says, they were really focused a lot on marijuana and decriminalization. I thought that was really interesting. And they're shy to talk about it, I think because they know it's illegal, right? It was interesting, I thought. And when someone, I think it was Michael, and I've changed the names, beside me said, he made this comment about how you should how do you change or receive support? And he's like, well, the guy on the street. And then Joseph said, what do you mean the guy on the street? The guy who gives you your stuff? And then Joseph was laughing and saying, well, you told us to be honest. What Joseph was doing there was just checking to see if it's okay to talk about it. So I think, especially if we continue with that group, that we need to create some space to talk frankly and to make sure that no one is not threatened by us, to find out what are those issues? So then would we end up focusing on decriminalization of pot as the issue that they want to do? Well, maybe that could be challenging. So the youth, as you can see from this excerpt, were reflecting on their kind of ways in which they were testing whether they could talk about this with us. And they were right to be uncertain, right? And I think this excerpt kind of captures that, because we were like, hey, this is an important issue, but is this the one that we're going to focus on? We were concerned that this issue would delegitimize the youth, that they would be seen simply, they'd be dismissed as potheads or stoners. These categories themselves carry their own semiotic weight, signaling ignorance. And this concern was borne out when we raised the topic with youth workers, who are allies to the youth in a lot of ways, but they would roll their eyes or they'd smile indulgently and be like, oh, yeah, pot, sure. But we couldn't avoid the fact that the youth had signaled this interest over and over again, every single focus group. And as we moved towards the advocacy project and we conducted the dotmocracy that Valerie described, where we had them select, and we included decriminalizing pot in that selection of issues because we knew it was one that was a hot issue, but I think we were maybe secretly hoping they wouldn't pick it. But every time they did, all three focus groups, that was one of the issues that they all agreed they wanted to talk about. So then we had the film focus groups where we dug into the issues that they'd identified as most important that ultimately became the 3 topics for the films. And those discussions, we were able to dig a bit deeper. So having built up some trust and credibility with the youth over a period of several months, they started to speak more frankly about the issues that they faced in relation to marijuana. But I don't want to overstate the fact of our trust building. I think, in fact, it was the intervention by Joseph, someone I'm calling Joseph, who he's in the films as well. And he asked the right questions of the other youth. He was very good at translating between us middle-class academics and the youth and their street cultures. And what little we know about him is that, from what I gather, he came from, I would guess, a middle-class family. His aunt had run for office. It sounded like, that he'd ended up on the streets because of mental health breakdown in the family. But it sounds like he had kind of access and exposure to forms of cultural and political capital that the other youth didn't. So he knew but he also had been entrenched in street culture and so knew the language and experiences there. So he was able to ask the other youth the questions that started to elicit the issues that you see in the film. So issues around criminalization, around self-medicating for a whole range of disabilities and illnesses, the kind of repeat encounters with police. So this helped us better understand what was going on, and suddenly we were at a shared table, to return to Arendt's metaphor of common concern. So we were able to shift our understanding of pot use from belonging to the realm of the social, as being, to use Arendt's concept of the social, as being about health or addiction or the sort of discipline or lack of discipline of the individual, and into the realm of the political, as being about freedom from police harassment and criminalization. But the youth themselves were unable at first to find the right language to convey this to us. And as I said, I think this has to do with, kind of not having inculcated the doxa, the sort of ways of translating between their experiences of street life into a way that middle-class audiences can absorb and understand what's happening. But we had Joseph to translate and to help us figure out how to do that. But this was an act of translation. It was all of this, making the films is an act of interpretation, of editing, literally editing. This was a full day of filming that we got down to these 3 5-minute snippets, where we're seeking to represent the youth's who-ness out to the world through these films, but it's also a crafted who-ness. It's an edited who-ness. We're taking out the rough bits and leaving in the pieces that others will connect to or empathize with, sympathize with. We are bringing our skills as middle-class elites to the words of these youth in order to re-represent them out into the world. And this carries, of course, its own ethical dilemmas. So I'll leave you there with perhaps more questions than answers, which is where we're at anyways. And we'll open it to the floor for discussion or questions.